All right, hope you're well. I want to do a video to talk about teachers, how to find a good teacher on the path. And I want to say probably 20 different things here. So some of this is just really straightforward and I think somewhat universal. Or let's just say somewhat straightforward. Some of this is kind of well, let me just start. You want to find a teacher who is supportive, I mean, in a way, it's sort of hard to even speak about a subject this big because the path, it's like everybody, there are different moments on the path that are supported by different teachings, by different I I did a video recently talking about there's no perfect teacher. And so this is in a way sort of a follow-up or riffing off of a related topic. And I want to caution, I guess, just up front to be too idealistic in the search for a teacher and finding a teacher. Try not to be too, idealistic in terms of finding, that was the point of that other video, that you're not really ever going to find the perfect teacher. Part of this is trusting your instincts. Part of this is just kind of natural resonance. When the student is ready, the teacher appears, that kind of a thing, in a sense. I don't know how far I want to endorse a statement like that, but I could say just at a bare minimum, this would be something that's universally applicable. No abuse. Very obvious, goes without saying kind of a thing to say, but in my mind, as I, reflect on it, think about it, having listened to other people's reflections on this topic, that I'm sure there's many varieties and shades of abuse, but things to look out for at the extreme. It's really kind of three different categories. Financial abuse. Is this teacher extorting money, charging crazy amounts? Is there a kind of pressure around donations or a rigidity there, or kind of something that feels off there around money? And let me flag that and come back to that topic. So money is one area to look out for with teachers. Sexual manipulation and abuse. This one is a little bit harder to interface with, and it tends to be male teachers with younger female students. If we were to do kind of just a profile of this particular category of abuse, I think that'd be probably the most common form that it takes. And how do you get a sense of that? Well, that's a tough one, because this is sort of one of those that you may not always be able to sense until you get really close to a teaching and to a teacher, and up close observation, and even then it may take a while. Sometimes you don't fully contend with or recognize what's happening until something comes to light, until something egregious happens, or until somebody reports an incident or something. That said, there's a place for intuition here too, and you can sense if you're sensitive. Let me pause that there, because it's going to tie into the third form. So money games, sex manipulation, and power over the student's life. And that can take on different forms, more and more control over students and the sangha or the community or whatever, and their behavior, their life choices. I mean, this could really probably run the gamut of, certain religious sects, religious cults, where there's a high demand on conformity with dress, behavior, speech, controlling, things like the relationships of a student. In a sense, these are all just different forms of power control. So that's I'm kind of putting it as three different categories, but that's kind of one of the underlying things here, is that power dynamic. But let me zero in just a little bit on, I don't want to spend the whole video just talking about this part, but it is kind of a useful thing as a baseline. With money, and a lot of this experience, I'm referencing teachings that I guess generally would be kind of under the umbrella of non-duality. Spiritual healing, spiritual teachings, non-duality. It almost doesn't so much matter what flavor of spirituality, because there's certain predictable patterns, and it's like a predictable form that a lot of this distortion and abuse can take place. But I just bring that up because with money, see, there's kind of two different sides of this, and both are out of balance. You can have this sense in spirituality that money is dirty. And that's not a misplaced sense at all, because money is very corrupting, has the potential to be very corrupting, because there's an existential cord there that it ties into very kind of fundamental things, in in an individual's life. And money translates to, money and wealth in this world can provide many opportunities, obviously. Not saying anything controversial here, I don't think, but you can get this notion, because of all the dangers and distortions possible around finances and money, that it's obscene for spiritual teachers to charge money. You can get that notion, right? And that's wrong. That's not right at all. Because somebody who's dedicated their life to God and to healing and to supporting people, that's a high calling, and that's something that is good to support, financially. We're talking about in this specific domain. But that's a good, potentially a good thing and a healthy thing and a supportive thing. And, teachers, people who take on that, offering support in that way, it's not bad that they should be compensated, right? It helps them to do what they're doing. So money is not dirty inherently in that sense. It's an exchange of value, you could think of, in one sense. But one thing you can do, and one thing you'll notice, is healers and teachers, there's a range of fees. I'm not sure what the right word is here, but fees or cost or whatever, hourly rate, there's a range of services here, so it's kind of have to, kind of depends on what we're talking about here. But a lot of teachers will offer like a one-on-one type of a session, or a weekly meeting or meditation meeting or healing session, or so there's a different range of services. But some of the prices, if you've done some exploration here, you'll realize there's a range from reasonable to crazy. Just very, very inflated. At least seems to me very, very charging, just really exorbitant. Is that how you say that word? Extravagant amounts, hourly fees, hundreds and hundreds of dollars. But it's kind of good to do some research and get a sense of what people are charging, so that you kind of have an internal sense of a range here. A lot of teachers will do like a sliding scale, for people that are not able to pay as much, or, maybe not be as financially off. That's just one small thing, but that might be a good indicator, that this is somebody that is not driven so, not so hard. What am I trying to say here? That the money aspect of it is not as, they're not as aggressive, I guess. I can't think of the right way to express that, forgive me. So that might be a good indicator, but you can get a sense of, hourly rates amongst different teachers and different services, and that's kind of one way to get, maybe a little bit more peace of mind about what's being charged. And you can always talk to a teacher also and say, hey, I'm really struggling. Is there any way you can give me a discount? Or, would it be possible to try out a session or just talk a little bit first and see if there's any flexibility there. Now, if there's not, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's something fishy or wrong or bad. Sometimes it's okay to just have a fixed price. This is what I charge. This is what I think the service is worth. For a lot of these teachers, they've dedicated their lives to it. In this day and age with YouTube and other avenues, you can it's good to do your due diligence and get a sense of who the teacher is, what they offer, if this is something useful to you. And so you play an active role in figuring out what they're charging appropriate and period, but also appropriate for what I can afford. And one thing I notice with a lot of teachers that I admire and feel, are healthy and ethical and good teachers is they often offer, a variety of access points. A retreat may be pretty expensive, but they've got, hours and hours of talks, free downloads, YouTube videos, blogs, whatever, and other ways that they're getting the information out that are not behind a paywall, Sometimes that can be an indicator of a scam, is like, or somebody who's overly driven by the bottom line, by the, how much money is being charged, is that everything is behind a paywall, and it's like you have to progressively invest more and more money to get further and further into the teachings. Now, most teachers that would be safe to be around, healthy to be around, there's a transparency there about what they charge, why they charge it, and and I've found many of them to be very generous, of the ones that I'll kind of indicate here. Well, I don't know if I'm going to say any names, but maybe I will. That there's often a kind of generosity. One teacher I've worked a lot with, man, I can think of so many times he was very generous with the money and never, ever, ever made it a central issue. And because there's a trust thing there where you play a big role in this too, where you can exploit a teacher's generosity. So you got to be careful here with the money thing. But where a teacher has offered to give refunds to me, or given discount sessions, or even I think free sessions sometimes, or there's just a spirit of generosity and a spirit of, you can almost sense in some teachers that they trust God's providence. And for me, that's had the impact of, I do everything I can not to exploit teachers like that. And if I have the opportunity to, like even emailing with a teacher, that's taking some of their time that they would take time to respond. And I've often just offered unsolicited to teachers to, if I'd really appreciate a reply, and I'd be happy to give a donation. If I've written a long email and I get a really good response, sometimes I'll just give a donation, $10, $15 or whatever, from them taking their time to. So there's a relational aspect to all of this. But I kind of want to say with each of these points that I'm going to go into, there's a role for your intuition. And it's not like a deep calculation. It's with the teachers that I've found to be really ethical and balanced and healthy and non-abusive. There's not only just kind of a an ethical, that they come across as ethical. It's like there's that ethical dimension, but there's often a grace and a generosity there, which you'll find with some teachers, which I think is a really good sign. Excuse me. Now, with the sexual exploitation and inappropriate relationships that teachers can have with students, I'm not really sure what I can say about that, because your intuition is your best protection in these circumstances. Man, this is a tough one, because it's a very intimate, it can be a very intimate and almost, it can be a very intimate relationship with a teacher, because you're working on healing, you're working on connection with God, and this is a tough path, and it requires a kind of deep integrity there, because you're going to be potentially opening into some very vulnerable areas, and can bring forth very unhealed aspects within yourself and within the teacher. And so if the teacher hasn't done a lot of work, is not really healed, when you are vulnerable and open up, there's a real chance there for entanglement and enmeshment and confusion to arise. Now, you don't want to victim blame, so don't hear me saying that. But you also don't want to remove agency and accountability from all sides here, from the teachers and from the students. Students, there is a power dynamic there. However, it's just part of adult development that you have to, and part of the spiritual path that you have to more and more be accountable for your own projections. And that's the baseline primary thing is the teacher should not be messing around sexually with their students. It's just not a good. Does it sometimes happen that a teacher and a student fall in love, and it works out long term? I think that does happen sometimes. But as a general rule, so that's one thing, and even there, that's a very, very contentious thing, and not something I would feel comfortable with happening. Really, that's my own personal take on it. But that's one thing. But then there's a whole nother thing of kind of multiple students, repeated offenses, a pattern of, it's funny, one of the kind of common themes across cult leaders and stuff is the taking of multiple wives. And there's something that happens in this dynamic where power is kind of concentrated on one person, that I think this sexual exploitation and the ways our unhealed aspects of our psyches interface with that, it's almost textbook, it's almost normative. It's not healthy or good, but it just happens so often You see it so often. That it's never good, but in a sense, you could say it's almost not surprising. But I guess I want to say at least two things here. It's like the teacher, in therapy, if this was like a clinical setting, therapy is like a somewhat close analog to a lot of what happens with spiritual teaching. There's really strong ethical codes and guidelines around romantic relationships with the student, and how it's very anti-therapeutic, can be very detrimental, very harmful, and you just don't do it. It's a strong boundary around that. Now, when we're outside of kind of the governing authority of any kind of ethical code, ethics review board or anything like that, it's kind of the Wild West in a lot of these spiritual communities. I still think that's a pretty important boundary, just because it's safeguard, even if occasionally there is, a romantic relationship that develops into a long-term, stable, healthy thing. You do hear stories like that. It's the exception, it's not the rule, and it's much better to have a strong emphasis on that separation, because it does so much work in protecting against a lot of harms that can come. Anyways, so the teacher has a major responsibility, I would say the primary responsibility, to do their own healing work such that they're not tempted in that direction, but also to know how to skillfully disentangle from students that are projecting, a romantic image onto them, and use that, is that transference? I don't know, but use that energy in a way that can be reflective back into what's going on for the student, in a way that they can grow and kind of transform how they relate to people. Because I think for a lot of people, it's almost like a egoic strategy or a defense mechanism, or when it's tied up with some really deep things for people and their vulnerability, and how they attach to people sometimes can be sexually. It's not the deepest, healthiest way to go about your relationships, but it can happen in these really vulnerable relationship contexts, like with a spiritual teacher. Anyways, so on the one side, it's the teacher's ethical responsibility, moral responsibility, spiritual responsibility to protect the community, to protect themselves, protect the students. But I don't want to totally let students off the hook here. It's your responsibility, it's my responsibility, it's it's a collective responsibility to be clear about what you want. You're coming to a spiritual teacher, presumably to heal, to connect with truth, who you truly are, to connect with God, to connect with, the highest, to find peace, to transform your pain. And to be clear about that, this is not about finding a romantic partner. I'm sorry, but it's just not. Now, those yearnings and those desires, that can be fertile ground for exploration and for healing and self-discovery and for inquiry. But you have to play a role in not allowing for that pattern and that energy to take over, and that takes a certain self-awareness, and reflectiveness. If that is happening, to recognize that you're projecting that, to be open to transforming that, to working through that. So students, you all, I, us, we all, you all, I'll just say, you have a role there. And also in being wise enough to recognize if a teacher is out of alignment and getting the fuck out of there. Don't get caught up in that stuff. You know, it's important for you to recognize what's going on if a teacher is being inappropriate. If it's safe to call them out and to say, no, we're not doing this. It could be more skillful, like, hey, I've having these feelings come up and this is not healthy. This is not not that the feelings aren't understandable or you don't have to be ashamed of them, the feelings, but it's important to be clear about what you want, what you're doing. If you want a romantic relationship, perhaps do that, outside of, the context of a spiritual teacher. Anyways. It just gets messy. It gets messy real quick. For me, how I relate to a lot of this is because, again, it tends to be, a older male, or we'll just say male teacher and female students. And often we could probably even say generalize younger female students. So I'm not a young female. Hearing some Canadian geese, it sounds like. So I'm not really relating to it at that level, but I can say I've been in environments, and this is where your intuition plays a role, where it's typically not going to be the case where you catch a teacher and a student in the act, doing something inappropriate, but you can pick up on that energy. And often, again, I'm struggling with the right way to say this. It seems to be a shadow with some women that it's almost like an unconscious thing where they go into kind of a more flirtatious or seductive. Forgive me, I'm trying to find the right language here because I know how triggering and upsetting saying something like this could be. But it's almost like an egoic strategy, semi-conscious to unconscious, that when somebody feels vulnerable or they're vying for the attention of a teacher or something like that, one of the strategies, I think, especially for women, young women, tends to be kind of that sexual energy. And so it shouldn't be surprising that could come up in the context of say it's in a satsang or something, of a female student projecting that towards the teacher. Because that's just one of many different strategies, and all kinds of strategies can come up in the context of a satsang, regardless of the individual. Part of what we're doing here is we're getting tested and triggered and trying to work through some of these. We've got strategies because we live in an insane, chaotic, fucked up world. And so we fragment and we fall into these different strategies, egoic strategies. It's on some level to try in the attempt to find safety. Excuse me, that's part of the deeper dimension here. So it's not really about shaming anybody for their particular strategy. But part of what you want to pay attention to, if you're noticing that with a particular student, or maybe you're seeing a pattern, how is the teacher responding? Energetically, is the teacher feeding that, playing into that? Do they seem captured by that? In a way, it's like there's almost a deeper category here. It's kind of a control strategy. It's one of the things one of the games the ego likes to play. And sexual energy is a very potent energy. So is that a two-way thing, and the teacher's dancing that dance with them, or when that stuff comes at them, is there still just a stillness and a clarity with the teacher, and perhaps they don't say anything, but you just sense that the teacher's just locked in and not feeding that energy and going, helping to just go more directly into the present moment, more directly into what's going to be helpful and healing. Or perhaps even in a skillful way, the teacher is calling it out, maybe not directly to that person, but the teacher takes time in their general remarks or during satsang to talk about projection and talk about, So yeah, that's something to be aware of within yourself as a student, but also to pay attention to with teachers. And a part of this, it's kind of subtle. It's not really subtle, but it's energetic. It's not always going to be verbally, explicitly stated. So there's a part of this has to do with how sensitive you are and how willing you are to listen to your intuition on some of these things. Now, if you've got a lot of wounding in this area, sometimes your intuition might be impaired. And see, that's where it gets a little bit dicey and scary, where you might be picking up on something that really isn't there. So it doesn't hurt to have, to talk to a teacher. And you don't have to call them out in front of people. I think that's kind of a silliness that we've gotten kind of lost in this past decade or so. But yeah, see if there's a time that you could talk to the teacher and express some of this and see how they respond to that. Are they really defensive? Do they deflect? Or are they open to, kind of exploring that and talking? If that is something that you feel like you're picking up. I want to say something else here that is going to sound really hurtful, potentially, but is not intended that way for sure. Well, I'm not sure I really want to say it like that, actually. Part of me wants to say you get the teaching and the teacher that you... well, I don't want to say it this way because it's a little bit too cold, a little bit too harsh. Part of me, I was contemplating if I should say you get the teaching and the teacher that you deserve. But that's a little bit too harsh, a little bit too cold, and not necessarily true. Yeah, let me scratch that. That's not quite how I want to say it. But it's like if you're really wounded, you're really confused, you're really lost, there's a way in which you may, sad to say, may end up in a less healthy environment just because you maybe haven't had that healthy boundaries and healthy relationship modeled. And so you can more easily fall into what's familiar. And like, let me try to say it this way. If you were really, really healthy, healed, whatever, and you happen to go into a church service in the 60s, 70s, whenever it was, with preacher Preacher Jim Jones. Even with all the social pressures that can come with a high demand group like that, and a charismatic teacher, and if you're really healthy, I think there would have just been 15 red flags probably within the first service or the first week, and there's a certain way in which your own inner work and healing and health would have safeguarded you and insulated. It just wouldn't have been a match, and you probably naturally would have pretty quickly discerned what was going on, or had enough, specific incidents or just kind of the general feeling of dis-ease such that you would have gotten the hell out of there. I think that's pretty safe to say. But it's kind of a dangerous territory I'm walking into, because you don't want to say that you definitely don't want to say you deserve abuse if you've gotten into an abusive thing. So forgive me, I'm not trying to say that at all. I hope I'm not coming across that way. But people who are really vulnerable, who haven't done a lot of work, man, that's a really dangerous place to be. Because you can fall prey to unscrupulous people. Or even teachers that are, healed in certain ways but have major shadows that they haven't integrated, and it may not be that they're intentionally looking to harm people, but once they get into the gravity of a sangha and of a community, those unhealed areas the dysfunction of that gets amplified and kind of broadcast out across the group dynamic in ways that they may not have intended or anticipated. So, it gets a little bit complicated, and it's not always so insidious or consciously evil or intentionally evil. There can be kind of a gravity of shadow material that affects the group. You can kind of make some useful parallels and analogies to relationships, romantic relationships in your life. I think that's a pretty well understood psychological dynamic, that you sort of attract people who are at your level, in one way of talking about it, and that the more healed you are, the higher quality or the more healed relationship you tend to attract. I think that's maybe a better way of trying to explain what I'm saying here. But it's not always quite. And so part of it, it's almost developmental. You never want to downplay or dismiss or invalidate abuse at all. But you can kind of see that you can definitely use those experiences for growth and to help wake you up, and to, maybe you're in a context, and it doesn't have to be just horror show Jonestown, totally abusive cult, but there's degrees of relative health within these communities, and maybe as you grow, your association with a group no longer makes sense, and maybe it wasn't all bad. You acquired some knowledge and strength and insight, and maybe a part of what you learned from that experience is what doesn't work for you, and you get clear on what is healthy behavior, in part by seeing what's unhealthy and what's hurtful and what's not supportive. And so there can be kind of an evolutionary trajectory here of your own growth out of a group, growth out of a teacher, out of a teaching, and into a healthier place. that's a possibility, but it could also be that you are in a pretty wounded place and you just have the good fortune of finding a sane, relatively healthy, good, kind, supportive teacher right away. It doesn't have to be that you go through the gauntlet of confusion and enmeshment and power games and abuse and all that stuff. It doesn't have to be that at all. You can be very unhealed and just have the good fortune or just even the kind of intuitive clarity of finding a good teacher. Now, by good teacher, I said this in another video, and I did a video on this. I've kind of been riffing a lot on this concept. Is it Louise Winnicott, Donald Winnicott? Some psychologist, therapist has this term. I don't know if they're still alive. I'm not even sure what decade it's from. Maybe the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I don't know. But they talk about, in terms of child development, the good enough parent. And it's a kind of just, I like what's implied by that term. It's kind of grounded, it's down to earth. It's not, it's kind of as opposed to the perfect parent, right? It's not saying the perfect, never makes a mistake, never has a hair out of place, has all their ducks in a row parent. No, it's the good enough parent. And there's a couple things that are implied by that. It's like, it's this idea that you don't have to be totally perfect, where you meet where your child never gets a bump or a scrape or a bruise, and just everything in their developmental milestones and trajectory is perfectly supported, and they glide through life, developing in the most robust, healthy way because of your careful, perfect attentiveness to their needs and to that process. No, it's more like the concept that if you're there, you support the child feels safe, the child feels loved, and there's kind of a foundation of support and, safety and trust that the child feels. There's a consistency, a nurture, with the parent, a responsiveness towards the child. Then that is a buffer and a safeguard and protection and creates a context for a healthy development, and allows for mistakes to happen, and allows for ruptures within the relationship, because it's happening within the context of a kind of stability between the parent and the child that doesn't rely on being virtuoso in child developmental psychology or something like that. And that term, the good enough parent, I think is something similar you can apply to teachers. Is this a good enough teacher? And what that would imply in this case would be something like, is there a humility with the teacher? Is there a generosity there? Like the one teacher I'm thinking of, he's been a pretty good template for a lot of this. Craig Holiday. I've heard him apologize many times in satsang if he's got something wrong, or to me, when I've had sessions with him and raised something that I was upset about, not that I was always right or anything like that, but there's a willingness there and a humility that you could sense of like, hey, I apologize, I really didn't intend to hurt you, or I'm sorry I let you down, or there's a humanity there. I guess that would be another important quality that the teacher lets you see to some extent. You have to be kind of skillful here too as a teacher, how much you disclose, but that they're not perfect, that they have an acknowledgement of their own deficiencies, their own humanity, their own imperfections. That can be a very useful thing to clock, to notice, to take note of in a teacher. That there's a lightheartedness about their own foibles, and they're willing to share their own process. And that it's not like they're just handing down perfect distillations of cosmic truth in every word, and their every word is law. No, there's like a relational groundedness, a humility there, a humor there can be an important quality. Um, how do they respond to feedback? How are they when they offer feedback? Are they overly harsh, condemnatory? Do they just flatten students out and totally, you know, is there kind of gentleness or skill in how they communicate with the student and helping them to explore what's going on in their experience? Not that there's never a firmness. You don't want, that's a positive quality, a teacher that can be direct and be firm. But is it done in the context of humiliating or trying to break a student's ego? That tends to be an indicator that it's probably not the healthiest dynamic. How are they over time? Do they have big mood swings? And if you stay with the teaching long enough and you engage with the teacher, one-on-one, and see them in different contexts, how do they show up in all those contexts? Again, you're not looking for perfection or that they never have a misstep or say a stupid thing or anything like that, but just kind of the general tenor of their presence and what they offer. Are they really kind in satsang and then rip you to shreds in an email or say awful things? Are they gossiping? Hopefully they're not gossiping. I mean, I almost don't even need to say that, but you sometimes hear. And what is the general health of the community around them? That can be a good question. Is there a lot of, fear, gossip, distrust, power struggles? I think there's probably always going to be some power struggles in any human group, so it's not necessarily the bad thing, but is the teacher and the teaching pointing people back into their own experience as much as possible and encouraging us and providing a context and an environment for us to do our, you, us, me, whoever, to do our own individual work? Not that it can't happen in the context of support, but do you get the sense that the teacher's priority is to project all their knowledge, and it's almost like there's a identification, or somehow it's important for the teacher to express their enlightenment, their power, the level that they're on? Or do you see the teacher being able to meet people where they're at? Are they trying to draw out where that person is at, meet them where they're at? Are they listening to what's being said? Is there space for two-way communication and for listening and for a student to be vulnerable and to open up and to share? And do you get the sense that the teacher is more there in kind of a facilitative process, not that they're not guiding, not that they're not being responsive and offering their insights and their wisdom, but a lot of the path and a lot of what a good teacher will do is help you to unfold that within yourself. And a lot of teachers, one of the strategies that can be really helpful is asking questions. Are they asking questions that help you to better coordinate, better locate what's going on within you? Are they helping to facilitate that process within you? Or is it more about asserting their, greatness? Hopefully it's not that. I'm being kind of saying some kind of extreme hyperbolic things here, but you feel that the teacher is there to support the process in their students. Or in the people that show up there. Maybe we don't even want to use the word student. Guiding them back to their own experience. Helping them to become more of who they are rather than a robot, rather than, become more of themselves rather than a devotee or a student or whatever, helping to free them from any kind of role. I don't know. Let me see if there's anything else I want to say here. Yeah, if they mess up, are they willing to take accountability, willing to apologize, or whatever accountability looks like? Man, all of these are kind of, there's like different ways you can look at it because we've gotten into this kind of witch hunt era with figures of authority. And so sometimes the demands placed on a teacher around accountability are ideologically driven and not always the healthiest. So I kind of hesitate a little bit there, but I mean, yeah, is there just a basic humility, I guess, is part of it. And a recognition that even if they weren't being malicious, sometimes they could say something kind of dumb or hurtful or is there lightheartedness there? Is there a fun? Is there a play? Is there a humor? Not a humor that wounds or humiliates, but just kind of a lightheartedness, an ability to smile and laugh. And the other thing is, experientially, do you have a sense that this teacher is speaking from a place of experience, an embodied place, you could say, rather than a conceptual thing? That's a really fundamental thing. You have to have the ethical component and all these other things, but the teacher has to have some skill and ability to articulate, and they have to have done their own work on some level. And so that's something you can investigate. You can ask the teacher directly or on their website or whatever, figure out what it is that puts them in the position that they're in to offer support. And be clear on what it is you're looking for. If you're looking for somatic help and you go to somebody who's just self-inquiry, probably not the best alignment there. Not that you can't take teachings from them. Another thing, is to take, try not to get too locked in. There's a couple things that I want to say as usual around this topic too. It's like we live in an era of abundance in terms of access to teachings and teachers. And that's beautiful because you can survey the landscape. You can take a little bit from this teacher, a little bit from that teacher. You can discard what doesn't serve you. Now, Ram Dass has this word that he used, being a spiritual dilettante. And that word dilettante kind of implies the superficial dabbling with teachings. And that can be a trap where you never go deep. You're just, taking a little hit here, a little hit here, a little hit here. And that's not a good thing, really. But you also don't want to lock yourself in on a teacher, especially if and when you've outgrown it or your path has led you elsewhere. Have the capacity within yourself to commit if there's something good, and to really genuinely explore the teaching and to really, engage with it. And maybe that does last a lifetime for you. Maybe you found that one teacher relationship that is really the right one for you. But always keep the door open to try out and to listen to other perspectives, and to recognize sometimes you're with a teacher for a while and for innocent reasons, sometimes maybe for bad reasons, but sometimes it's just innocent reasons where you got what you needed from that teacher. It's time to move on. And there's an appropriateness and a skill in recognizing and allowing yourself to say, let me try something else here. I think my path is leading in a different direction, and the next step for me is to explore, some teachings with this person, or to have multiple teachers at the same time that you're getting something deep and useful from, in a sincere way, not in a superficial, dilettante-ish, superficial kind of a way. But you've got to, maybe two or three teachers, and there may be other teachers that you just enjoy their videos, or you read a book here. So there's all kinds of different levels of engagement here. And if it's useful, and if it's helpful, and if it facilitates growth for you, deepens your peace, deepens your connection, your intimacy, helps to heal inner divides, helps to heal inner splits, inner fragments, helps to integrate your process, that's really all that matters. And a good teacher is not going to be possessive or jealous. The teacher hopefully is there to facilitate a process for you and to help you come into a richer, fuller contact with your own spirit, your own soul, with your own relationship with God. So don't move on too quickly, but don't be afraid to move on and to try out other things. Even to the extent that the teacher in that role becomes less and less necessary. Is that the right word here? I've noticed there's times where I just don't really need that, or look for or want that kind of as much engagement with a teacher. And that's okay too. The point of the path is not to collect teachers. It's that they're there for you, when you need the support. It's great that they're there. What a wonderful thing for people in this world that are willing to support. But, if you're doing all right, and you've got a practice and you've got tools in your toolkit, it's okay. You don't have to feel bad if you're not really feeling like you need as much engagement at a certain point. I don't know. So, anyways, let me see if there's anything else. I think that's enough. Take care.